"You can't do this to me. I'm the HOA president. I have rights. You're violating my constitutional freedoms." Karen's voice cracked as she screamed from behind the reinforced glass door, her perfectly manicured nails scratching futilely against the surface. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched her panic, trapped in what used to be my own guest bathroom, now converted into the most secure holding cell a software engineer's budget could afford. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. Because this story starts 3 months ago when I thought the biggest problem in my life was debugging code at my day job. My name is Richard, and I'm what you might call a quiet neighbor. I work from home most days, developing security software for a tech company downtown. I moved to Willowbrook Estates thinking I'd found the perfect suburban sanctuary, a place where I could focus on my work and maybe finally finish the novel I'd been writing for 5 years. The neighborhood seemed ideal: manicured lawns, friendly faces, and an HOA that promised to maintain property values and community standards. What I didn't know was that our HOA president, Karen Whitfield, had her own interpretation of what maintaining community standards meant. Karen was one of those people who seemed to have been born with a clipboard in her hand and a complaint on her lips. She'd been HOA president for 7 years running, not because people loved her leadership style, but because nobody else wanted to deal with the headaches that came with the position. She was in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed, even when she was prowling the neighborhood looking for violations, and she had this way of speaking that made every conversation sound like a disciplinary hearing. I first encountered Karen during my second week in the neighborhood. I was setting up my home office when I heard a sharp knock at my door. There she stood, holding a thick binder and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates," she said, though her tone suggested this was more of a warning than a greeting. "I'm Karen Whitfield, your HOA president. I wanted to personally deliver your welcome packet and go over some of our community guidelines." What followed was a 45-minute lecture about everything from acceptable mailbox styles to the precise shade of beige my house trim should be. She made notes in her binder about my lawn, which apparently needed edging, and my driveway, which had a small oil stain that violated Section 12.4 of the community standards. I nodded politely and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Karen became a constant presence in my life. She'd appear at my door with violation notices for the most ridiculous things. My garbage cans were 2 inches too far from the curb. My garden hose was visible from the street, which apparently created an unsightly appearance. I had a package delivered that sat on my porch for 3 hours before I got home from a rare office day, and somehow that warranted a formal warning about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Each time, I'd politely accept her notices, make the requested changes, and hope that would satisfy her. But Karen seemed to interpret my compliance as weakness, and her demands became increasingly unreasonable. She started showing up unannounced to inspect my backyard, claiming she'd received complaints about my landscaping. She'd peer over my fence and take photos, muttering about property line violations and unauthorized plantings. When I installed a small security camera by my front door after a package theft in the neighborhood, she immediately issued a violation notice, claiming it was an unapproved exterior modification. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was working late, deep in debugging a particularly stubborn piece of encryption code, when I heard my back door open. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. I lived alone, and I was certain I'd locked all the doors before settling in for the night. But then I heard footsteps in my kitchen, deliberate and purposeful. My heart hammered as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my desk and crept toward the sound. What I found defied belief. Karen Whitfield was standing in my kitchen, wearing dark clothing and latex gloves, methodically going through my cabinets with a flashlight. She had a clipboard, naturally, and she was making notes about something. When she saw me, she didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. "Richard," she said, as calmly as if we'd bumped into each other at the grocery store, "I'm conducting a routine inspection for health code violations. We've had reports of pest issues in this area. And as HOA president, I have the authority to investigate potential threats to community wellness." I stood there, bat in hand, Trying to process what I was hearing. "You broke into my house," I said, my voice barely controlled. "This is breaking and entering. I'm calling the police." Karen's expression hardened. "I have master keys to all properties in this development, as part of my HOA duties." "This isn't breaking and entering, it's a legitimate inspection if you interfere with my official duties. You'll be in violation of your homeowner agreement." Section 15.7. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my kitchen, focusing on a few dishes I'd left in the sink and a coffee mug on the counter. "Unsanitary conditions," she muttered, making notes. "Failure to maintain acceptable cleanliness standards." I called the police anyway, but when they arrived, Karen had already left. The officers listened to my story with a kind of polite skepticism reserved for complaints that sound too crazy to be true. They took my statement, but explained that without evidence of forced entry or theft, and given Karen's claims about HOA inspection rights, it would be difficult to pursue charges. They suggested I change my locks and consider installing more security cameras. The next morning, I found a formal violation notice taped to my door. Karen had cited me for 12 different infractions based on her midnight inspection, including improperly stored food items, inadequate kitchen sanitation, and failure to maintain acceptable indoor air quality. Each violation came with a fine, totaling $850. The notice also informed me that I was now on probationary status and subject to additional inspections at any time. That's when I realized that calling the police and changing my locks wasn't going to solve this problem. Karen had found a way to weaponize the HOA rules to justify her increasingly invasive behavior, and she clearly had no intention of stopping. But what Karen didn't know was that my background in security software had taught me a few things about surveillance, documentation, and building airtight cases. If she wanted to play games with rules and regulations, I was going to make sure I knew all the rules better than she did. I spent the next week diving deep into our HOA charter, community bylaws, and local housing laws. What I discovered was that Karen had been operating far outside her actual authority for years. The HOA had no right to conduct interior inspections without written notice and homeowner consent. The master key system she referenced didn't exist in our community documents. Most importantly, her midnight visits weren't just violations of HOA procedure. They were criminal trespassing, and I was going to prove it. My first step was upgrading my security system. I installed cameras at every entrance, motion sensors throughout the house, and a silent alarm system that would alert me to any intrusion. I also set up a dedicated server in my basement to record and store everything with automatic backups to a secure cloud service. If Karen was going to continue her nocturnal inspections, I was going to document every second of it. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights after installing my new security system, the motion sensors triggered at 2:15 a.m. I watched from my bedroom monitor as Karen used a lock-picking set to open my back door, apparently having discovered that I'd changed the locks. She was dressed in all black, wearing gloves and a small headlamp, and she moved through my house with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. This time, instead of confronting her, I let her work. I watched as she photographed my living room, measured the distance between my furniture and the walls, and made extensive notes about everything from the brand of my television to the number of books on my shelves. She spent nearly an hour in my house, and every second of it was recorded in high definition from multiple angles. But I needed more than just evidence of one break-in. I needed to establish a pattern of behavior that would make it impossible for Karen to claim this was a legitimate HOA function. So I waited, and I watched, and I documented. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen broke into my house 4 more times. Each visit followed a similar pattern. She'd arrive between 2 and 3 a.m., spend an hour or more inside, and leave behind a violation notice the next morning, citing infractions she'd discovered during her illegal searches. The violation notices became increasingly petty and vindictive. She cited me for having mismatched throw pillows, for storing cereal boxes in the wrong cabinet, for having too many electronic devices plugged in at once. One particularly absurd notice fined me for maintaining an excessive number of coffee mugs, which apparently violated the community's commitment to minimalist living standards. Each notice came with escalating fines and increasingly threatening language about potential legal action and forced compliance measures. But Karen was making a crucial mistake. In her arrogance, she was creating a paper trail that directly connected her illegal entries to specific observations she could only have made by being inside my house. Every violation notice was time-stamped evidence of her criminal activity, and I was building a case that would be impossible to refute. While I was gathering evidence, I was also researching Karen's background and her tenure as HOA president. What I found painted a disturbing picture of abuse of power that went far beyond my situation. I reached out to other homeowners in the community and discovered that Karen had been terrorizing residents for years. She'd forced elderly homeowner Marcus Johnson to spend thousands of dollars on unnecessary landscaping changes. She'd driven young couple David and Sarah Martinez to sell their home after months of harassment over their children's playground equipment. She'd even managed to get Jessica Thompson evicted from her rental property by pressuring the landlord with bogus violation notices. The more I learned, the more I realized that stopping Karen wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about protecting an entire community from a petty tyrant who'd been operating without oversight or accountability for far too long. My plan began to take shape. I wasn't just going to expose Karen's illegal activities. I was going to dismantle her entire system of intimidation and abuse. But first, I needed to gather more evidence and set the perfect trap. I started by documenting everything Karen had ever sent me, creating a comprehensive database of her violation notices, fines, and threats. I also began secretly recording my interactions with other homeowners, building a case file that showed the extent of her harassment campaign. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Karen had been embezzling HOA funds to pay for her surveillance activities. The lock-picking tools, the professional-grade cameras she used to photograph violations, even the legal threats she'd been making, were all being funded by community dues that should have been going toward actual neighborhood improvements. I found receipts hidden in her office files during a legitimate HOA meeting, and I photographed everything. By mid-November, I had enough evidence to bury Karen in criminal and civil liability, but I wanted something more dramatic, something that would expose her behavior in a way that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. I wanted to catch her in the act and confront her with undeniable proof of her crimes in front of the entire community. So, I set a trap. I let it slip during casual conversations with neighbors that I was going out of town for a long weekend to visit family. I made a show of packing my car and asking my neighbor Emily to keep an eye on the house. But instead of leaving, I set up a command center in my basement with live feeds from all my cameras and waited for Karen to take the bait. She didn't disappoint. On Friday night at 2:30 a.m., Karen arrived at my house with what appeared to be a full inspection kit. She had cameras, measuring tools, sample containers, and a thick folder of violation forms already partially filled out. This wasn't going to be a quick reconnaissance mission. She was planning to conduct the most thorough illegal search yet, probably intending to hit me with enough violations to force me out of the neighborhood entirely. I watched from my basement as she picked my locks and entered through the back door. But this time, I was ready for her. As soon as she was fully inside and had begun her inspection routine, I activated a system I'd been working on for weeks. Every exit from my house suddenly sealed with reinforced steel panels that slid down from hidden tracks in the door frames. The windows were similarly secured with retractable bars that locked into place with a satisfying click. Karen was trapped, and she knew it immediately. I heard her gasp and then run toward the front door, only to find her escape route blocked. She tried the back door, the side door, even the basement entrance, but every exit was sealed tight. The beauty of my system was that it could only be controlled from my basement command center, and it had backup power that would keep it running for hours even if she managed to cut the main electrical supply. Karen was trapped in my house, just like I'd been trapped by her harassment for months. But unlike her illegal activities, my trap was perfectly legal. She was a criminal caught in the act of breaking and entering, and I was simply detaining her until the proper authorities could arrive. I let her panic for a few minutes, listening to her increasingly frantic attempts to find an escape route. Then I activated the intercom system I'd installed throughout the house. "Good evening, Karen," I said, my voice echoing from speakers in every room. "I see you've decided to conduct another one of your unauthorized inspections." Her response was immediate and explosive. "Richard, what is this? You can't keep me here!" "This is kidnapping. I'm calling the police." I almost laughed at the irony. "Please do call the police, Karen. I'd love to explain to them how you broke into my house in the middle of the night. Again, for the 6th time in 3 weeks. While I have video evidence of every single illegal entry." There was a long silence, and I could see on my monitors that Karen was standing in my living room. Her face pale as she realized the implications of what I'd just said. She was finally beginning to understand that she'd walked into a trap and that I had evidence of all her previous crimes. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She'd built her entire identity around being in control, around being the one who made the rules and enforced them on others. The idea that someone had outsmarted her, that someone had turned her own tactics against her, was more than her ego could handle. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice taking on the threatening tone I'd heard so many times before. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority here. When I get out of here, I'm going to make your life a living hell. I'll fine you into bankruptcy. I'll get you evicted. I'll make sure you never find peace in this community." But her threats didn't have the same power they'd had before. I had evidence of her crimes, proof of her embezzlement, documentation of her harassment of multiple homeowners. More importantly, I had her trapped and recorded, providing a real-time confession of her abuse of power. "Actually, Karen," I said through the intercom, "I don't think you'll be in a position to threaten anyone much longer. You see, I've been documenting your illegal activities for weeks. Every break-in, every fraudulent violation notice, every dollar you've stolen from the HOA budget to fund your harassment campaign. I have it all." I began playing back recordings of her previous break-ins on the screens I'd installed throughout the house. Karen watched in horror as she saw herself picking locks, rifling through my belongings, and making notes for violation reports based on her illegal searches. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. She couldn't claim these were legitimate inspections when the recordings clearly showed her breaking and entering in the middle of the night. As the recordings played, I continued my explanation. "I also have documentation of your harassment of other homeowners. Marcus Johnson's forced landscaping expenses, the Martinez family's playground equipment harassment, Jessica Thompson's eviction. All of it connected back to your abuse of HOA authority." Karen's composure was cracking. She'd gone from demanding her release to trying to justify her actions to making increasingly desperate threats. But I wasn't finished. I had one more surprise for her. "The best part, Karen, is that you're not just trapped in my house. You're trapped in my guest bathroom." I activated the final phase of my system, and steel panels slid across the doorways leading out of the small bathroom adjacent to my kitchen. The space was secure, well-ventilated, and equipped with basic necessities, but it was also escape-proof. Karen found herself in a space roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with reinforced walls, a locked door, and no way out, except through me. Her panic reached new heights as she realized the full extent of her situation. She pounded on the door, screamed threats and demands, and eventually broke down into tears of frustrated rage. But I wasn't done talking. "Here's what's going to happen, Karen. In about an hour, the police are going to arrive. I've already sent them copies of all my evidence, including tonight's break-in. They'll arrest you for criminal trespassing, breaking and entering, harassment, and embezzlement. The HOA board, which I've also contacted, will be removing you from your position effective immediately." I could hear her hyperventilating through the intercom. "The homeowners you've been terrorizing will finally have justice. The money you've stolen will be recovered. And your reign of suburban tyranny will be over." Karen's response was a mixture of denial, rage, and desperate bargaining. She alternated between claiming her actions were legal, threatening to sue me, and offering to drop all my violation notices if I let her go. But it was too late for negotiations. The trap had been sprung, the evidence was overwhelming, and the authorities were already on their way. As we waited for the police to arrive, I reflected on how we'd gotten to this point. 3 months ago, I'd been a quiet software engineer, looking for a peaceful place to work and write. Karen had turned my life into a nightmare of harassment and illegal surveillance, thinking she could intimidate me into submission like she had so many others. But she'd made a crucial error in judgment. She'd targeted someone with the technical skills to document her crimes, the patience to build an airtight case, and the determination to see justice done. Her arrogance had blinded her to the possibility that someone might fight back effectively. She'd become so accustomed to terrorizing helpless homeowners that she'd forgotten there might be consequences for her actions. The police arrived exactly on schedule, and I released the security systems to let them in. They found Karen still trapped in the guest bathroom, still screaming about her rights and my supposed crimes. But when they saw the evidence I'd compiled, her protests quickly became irrelevant. The recordings of her break-ins were clear and indisputable. The documentation of her embezzlement was thorough and damning. The testimonies from other harassed homeowners painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. Karen was arrested on multiple charges, and I finally felt like I could breathe freely in my own home for the first time in months. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. Karen was removed from her HOA position immediately, and the board implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. The money she'd embezzled was recovered and returned to the community fund. Several homeowners came forward with additional complaints, leading to more charges against her. But the most satisfying outcome was watching Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority crumble completely. Without her HOA position, she was just another resident, subject to the same rules as everyone else. Her attempts to continue her harassment campaign failed miserably when other homeowners, emboldened by her downfall, began pushing back against her demands. She eventually sold her house and moved away from Willowbrook Estates, unable to tolerate living in a community where she no longer held power over others. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Without Karen's reign of terror, people began actually enjoying their homes again. Children played in yards without fear of violation notices. Homeowners made reasonable improvements without worrying about arbitrary fines. The HOA began functioning as it was supposed to, maintaining genuine community standards rather than enforcing one person's petty obsessions. As for me, I finally got the peace and quiet I'd been looking for. I finished my novel, got a promotion at work, and even started dating Emily, the neighbor who'd helped me with my fake vacation alibi. Sometimes I still check the security cameras out of habit, but these days the only nighttime visitors are the occasional raccoon or delivery driver. The irony of the whole situation wasn't lost on me. Karen had spent months trying to control every aspect of my life, using rules and regulations as weapons to intimidate and harass me. In the end, it was her own violation of rules and regulations that brought her down. She'd become so drunk on power that she'd forgotten the most basic rule of all: actions have consequences. The story spread throughout our suburb and beyond, becoming something of a legend among homeowners dealing with HOA abuse. I received messages from people across the country sharing their own Karen stories and asking for advice on how to fight back against harassment. Some had tried my approach of meticulous documentation and legal action with varying degrees of success. Others had found different ways to stand up to the petty tyrants in their own communities. What struck me most about these conversations was how common the problem was. Karen wasn't unique. She was part of a pattern of people who sought out small amounts of power, specifically so they could abuse it. They targeted communities and organizations where oversight was minimal and resistance was discouraged. They thrived on the fear and compliance of others, growing bolder with each successful intimidation. But they all shared the same fatal weakness. They believed their own hype. They became so convinced of their authority and untouchability that they stopped being careful. They made mistakes, left evidence, and eventually targeted someone who was willing and able to fight back effectively. The key to defeating them wasn't matching their aggression or stooping to their level. It was being smarter, more patient, and more thorough than they were. It was using their own weapons against them: rules, documentation, and legal consequences. Looking back, I realized that Karen had actually done me a favor in a twisted way. Her harassment had forced me to develop skills I'd never needed before. I'd learned about legal research, evidence gathering, and strategic planning. I'd discovered that I was capable of patience and determination I hadn't known I possessed. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to make the cost of bullying higher than the satisfaction they get from it. The months following Karen's arrest were some of the most productive of my life. Without the constant stress of her harassment, I was able to focus on my work with renewed energy. The security software I'd been developing took on new dimensions as I incorporated lessons learned from my own surveillance operation. My novel, inspired by recent events, practically wrote itself. The publishers loved the authentic feel of the antagonist, never suspecting that she was based on real experience. But perhaps the most valuable outcome was the sense of community that emerged in Willowbrook Estates after Karen's departure. Neighbors who had been isolated by fear of violation notices began talking to each other again. We discovered that many of us had similar interests and skills that we could share. Marcus Johnson, the elderly homeowner Karen had harassed about his landscaping, turned out to be a retired master gardener who was happy to help others with their yards. David and Sarah Martinez organized neighborhood barbecues where kids could play freely without worrying about noise violations. Jessica Thompson, who had returned to the neighborhood after Karen's arrest, started a book club that met in different homes each month. The HOA itself became a genuine community organization, rather than Karen's personal fiefdom. We elected a new board with rotating leadership and transparent processes. Meetings became collaborative discussions about actual community needs, rather than forums for Karen's latest grievances. We established clear procedures for addressing legitimate concerns while protecting homeowners from harassment and abuse. The changes weren't just administrative. The entire culture of the neighborhood shifted from fear-based compliance to collaborative community building. People took pride in their homes because they wanted to, not because they were afraid of fines. They followed reasonable community standards because they understood the benefits, not because they were threatened with legal action. I often wondered what Karen was doing in her new life, whether she'd learned anything from her experience or simply found new targets for her need to control others. I hoped, perhaps naively, that losing everything she'd built through abuse of power might have given her some perspective on her behavior. But I suspected that people like Karen rarely change fundamentally. They might modify their tactics or find new venues for their controlling behavior, but the underlying need to dominate others usually remains constant. What I knew for certain was that she'd lost her power to hurt people in our community, and that was enough. The other homeowners she'd terrorized were free to enjoy their homes without fear. New residents could move in without worrying about arbitrary harassment. Children could play in their yards without generating violation notices. The community could function as communities are supposed to, with mutual respect and reasonable cooperation rather than fear and intimidation. My own life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The security system I'd installed to catch Karen now served its original purpose of protecting my home from actual criminals. The documentation skills I'd developed helped me in my professional work. The confidence I'd gained from successfully fighting back against harassment served me well in other areas of life. Emily and I had grown closer through the shared experience of dealing with Karen's tyranny and celebrating her downfall. She'd been one of the homeowners Karen had targeted, receiving violation notices for everything from her flower garden being too colorful to her car being parked at a slightly imperfect angle in her driveway. Like many others, she'd been quietly enduring the harassment, hoping it would eventually stop if she just complied with every demand. Watching me fight back had inspired her to stand up for herself in other areas of her life, and she'd made significant changes in her career and personal relationships as a result. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the nature of power and resistance. Karen had seemed invincible when she was picking on isolated individuals who felt they had no choice but to comply with her demands. But her power was entirely dependent on her victims' belief that they were powerless. Once someone was willing to challenge her authority and document her abuses, her entire system of control collapsed remarkably quickly. The same pattern played out in many of the stories I heard from other homeowners dealing with HOA abuse. The Karens of the world relied on their targets being too intimidated, too isolated, or too uninformed to fight back effectively. They counted on people not knowing their rights, not understanding the legal system, and not having the resources to challenge authority. But when someone did fight back with patience, preparation, and proper documentation, the bullies almost always fell harder than anyone expected. Their own illegal and unethical behavior provided the weapons for their downfall. I'd also learned about the importance of community solidarity in dealing with abuse of power. Karen had been able to terrorize individual homeowners for years because each victim thought they were alone. Once we started talking to each other and sharing our experiences, her behavior was revealed as part of a systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. The collective testimony of multiple victims made it impossible for her to dismiss the complaints or claim they were misunderstandings. The legal authorities took the situation much more seriously when they saw evidence of widespread harassment rather than just one person's complaint. This lesson extended beyond HOA disputes to any situation where someone in a position of authority was abusing their power. Whether it's a workplace bully, an abusive landlord, or a corrupt official, they often rely on their victims remaining isolated and uninformed. Building connections with others in similar situations, sharing information and resources, and presenting a united front can be incredibly effective in stopping abuse. The technical aspects of my solution had also taught me about the power of modern surveillance technology when used ethically and legally. The same tools that Karen had tried to use for harassment and intimidation became the instruments of her downfall when used to document her crimes. The irony was perfect. She was caught by the very type of surveillance she'd been conducting illegally. But there was an important distinction between my use of surveillance technology and hers. I was monitoring my own property to protect myself from criminal activity. She was conducting illegal surveillance of others to gather information for harassment. I was documenting actual crimes in progress. She was looking for pretexts to impose arbitrary punishments. I was building evidence for legitimate legal action. She was creating fake violations to intimidate and control. The difference wasn't just legal, it was ethical. Technology is a tool that can be used for protection or oppression, depending on who's using it and why. In Karen's hands, cameras and documentation became weapons of harassment. In my hands, they became tools of justice and self-defense. The key was using them within the bounds of law and ethics, with clear purposes and appropriate oversight. Some wanted technical help setting up surveillance systems. Others needed guidance on legal research and documentation. Many just wanted to know that it was possible to fight back successfully against HOA abuse. I tried to help where I could, but I always emphasized that each situation was unique and required careful planning and legal consultation. What worked in my case might not be appropriate or effective in others. The most important advice I could give was to focus on documentation, legal compliance, and community building, rather than confrontation or revenge. The satisfaction of seeing Karen face consequences for her actions never really faded, but it evolved into something deeper than simple vindication. It became a reminder that individuals do have power to resist abuse and protect themselves and others, even when the system seems stacked against them. It proved that patience, intelligence, and determination could overcome intimidation and harassment. Most importantly, it showed that communities could heal and thrive once toxic influences were removed and people were free to interact with mutual respect rather than fear. The guest bathroom that had served as Karen's temporary prison was eventually converted back to its original purpose, but I kept the security modifications as a reminder of what I'd accomplished. Sometimes, when I was working late and heard the house settle, I'd remember those nights when Karen had prowled through my home, violating my privacy and gathering ammunition for her harassment campaign. The contrast with my current peaceful life was stark and satisfying. The novel I'd written, inspired by the experience, was published the following year and became something of a cult hit among people who dealt with similar situations. I received letters from readers sharing their own stories of standing up to petty tyrants and community bullies. Some had used my book as inspiration for their own resistance campaigns. Others simply found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in dealing with such problems. The book's success led to speaking engagements and interviews where I could share the lessons I'd learned. I always emphasized that the goal wasn't revenge or humiliation, but justice and community protection. The most effective resistance to abuse of power came from understanding the law, documenting violations, and working within the system rather than outside it. Violence, harassment, or illegal retaliation would only undermine legitimate complaints. and potentially create legal problems for the victims. Years later, I still lived in Willowbrook Estates, now as a respected member of a thriving community. The HOA functioned smoothly under rotating leadership, with transparent processes and reasonable enforcement of genuinely necessary rules. Property values had actually increased after Karen's departure, as potential buyers were attracted to a neighborhood with a reputation for community cooperation rather than arbitrary harassment. The security system I'd installed remained in place, but it rarely captured anything more exciting than package deliveries and the occasional lost cat. The basement command center had been converted into a home theater where neighbors sometimes gathered for movie nights. The reinforced bathroom had become a running joke among friends who knew the story, though new visitors never suspected its history. Emily and I had married in a ceremony held in the community park, with most of the neighborhood in attendance. It was the kind of celebration that would have been impossible under Karen's regime, when neighbors were afraid to interact freely for fear of generating violation notices. Our first child was due in the spring, and I looked forward to raising a family in a community where children could play freely and parents could focus on actual child rearing rather than HOA compliance. The experience with Karen had taught me that the price of freedom and community harmony was constant vigilance against those who would abuse power for personal satisfaction. It had shown me that individuals could make a difference when they were willing to stand up for themselves and others. Most importantly, it had proven that justice was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable abuse, when approached with intelligence, patience, and determination. Every time I saw a news story about HOA abuse or community harassment, I thought about Karen and the lesson she'd taught me about the nature of power and resistance. She'd intended to break my spirit and drive me from my home. Instead, she'd given me the opportunity to discover strengths I didn't know I had, and to help create the kind of community I'd always wanted to live in. The story of Karen's downfall had become part of the neighborhood's oral history, shared with new residents as both entertainment and education. It served as a warning to potential future Karens that the community wouldn't tolerate abuse of power, and as encouragement to residents that they didn't have to endure harassment in silence. The lesson was clear. Bullies rely on their victims' isolation and ignorance. When people work together, document abuse, and use legal channels effectively, even the most entrenched tyrants can be brought down. The most lasting impact of the whole experience was the realization that home truly was what I made it. Karen had tried to turn my house into a source of stress and fear, a place where I couldn't relax because I never knew when she might intrude with another arbitrary violation. By fighting back and reclaiming my space, I'd created something better than just a house. I'd helped build a real community where people could actually enjoy their homes and their neighbors. The guest bathroom where Karen had spent her final moments as HOA president had been the perfect metaphor for her entire approach to power. She'd tried to control every aspect of other people's lives, but in the end, she'd trapped herself in a prison of her own making. Her need to dominate and intimidate had led her to break laws and violate ethics until she had no choice but to face the consequences. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. She'd screamed about her rights while violating everyone else's, and in the end, she'd learned that rights come with responsibilities, and power comes with accountability. Sometimes, late at night when I was working in my home office, I'd remember that first encounter with Karen and her binder full of violations. I'd think about how different things might have been if I'd given in to her demands, accepted her harassment as the price of living in the neighborhood, and tried to avoid her attention rather than documenting her crimes. The community would still be living under her tyranny, and she'd probably have driven out several more families by now. Instead, Willowbrook Estates had become the kind of place I'd hoped to find when I first moved there. A real community, where people looked out for each other, where children could play freely, where homeowners could take pride in their properties without fear of arbitrary punishment. It was a reminder that sometimes the best defense against injustice is a good offense, carefully planned and legally executed.